Hello and welcome to Session 7 of the 2021 UPRT Safety Summit for Professional Pilots Worldwide. I'm Randy Brooks, and it's my honor and pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this session, Captain Philip Adrian. Captain Adrian is going to be speaking to us on task-to-tool approach for UPRT. Don't wait for perfect when you can use good enough. And Captain Adrian should know he's the CEO of MPS, the world's leading manufacturer of fixed-base simulator training devices for both the Airbus A320 and Boeing 737. Philip came to MPS from Boeing, where he served for 11 years in a variety of capacities, ending up as chief pilot for regulatory strategy. Philip is type rated in the 737, the 777, the 787, and he has instructed and served in flight test on all three of those models. Philip co-chaired the FAA Aviation Rulemaking Committee regarding upset prevention and recovery training, the Loss of Control Avoidance and Recovery Training ARC. He also chaired the EASA Working Group on Regulatory Affairs for Upset Prevention and Recovery Training. Philip is the vice chair, the chair-elect for the Royal Aeronautical Society's Flight Crew Training Group, and is a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Captain Philip Adrian.
Thank you, Randy, for that very nice introduction, and good day to everybody. And welcome to my presentation, Task-to-Tool Approach for Upset Prevention and Recovery Training, Why You Shouldn't Wait for Perfect When You Can Use Good Enough. My agenda will cover the current training realities. I'll go back to where we were, to where we are now, and where we're going, and how the regulatory activity and the intent is supporting that. And I'll end with a conclusion. But let's start where we are now. Especially regarding upset prevention and recovery training, despite significant efforts and the work we did at Lockhart, most of the focus of industry is still almost exclusively on recovery training, which is and remains important, but it's not the only thing. What we tried to make sure at Lockhart is that prevention training should be the basis of any upset prevention and recovery training. We also often, because the focus on recovery training, unnecessarily train on over-capable equipment and therefore at too high a cost. And that is especially true after the licensing part of the training, the on-airplane part, when we're using simulators. We also tend to wait for the perfect technological solution before we even start training. And during my presentation, I hope I can convince you that there is a good enough solution. So what do we need? Well, we need to focus on the entirety of training, with prevention training taking a much larger role. So we need to start training early, we need to do it right, and not wait for the perfect technical solution. Because in the end, the training needs analysis drives the device requirements. And for the simulators, that can be done via the FSTD capability signature, or FCS, to which I'll come later. And this is what task-to-tool is all about. In the end, the training drives the tool, and devices are a means to an end and not an end in itself. We also need to understand that blended learning, where we match the learning objectives and the competency achievement, will drive the tools. But in the end, use of qualified instructors to complement the tools is your best safety measure and will provide your best quality of training. So a little bit of history. We started here with these kind of simulators supporting these kind of airplanes. And even in the current training society, we can still see these devices used on a very limited basis, but they can have their tasks. But this is what we're training now. This is on the full flight simulator, fixed base devices, all other kind of tools. But what's next? Well, we have seen VR, AR, and MR make their ways into aviation industry, as well as AI. What we need to understand is that we need to identify what we actually need. And that is tools that support the training and competency achievement at the level of the student. That means the tools can vary throughout the career. For example, training aircraft in the beginning don't need to be fully aerobatically capable for a large part of the training. But especially when there's a risk of exceeding the airplane capability, we need to ensure that the right tool, which could be an aerobatic airplane, but especially the right instructor and the risk mitigation strategies are used. And we need to use all tools, airplanes and simulators, well within their capability. In the type rating, we also need to understand that the tool needs to teach the candidates the signs and the type-specific characteristics of approaching an undesired aircraft state. That means that we need to learn how the airplane is talking to us, because the goal for the students in the end is to learn that at any of these first signs, recovery needs to take place rather than wait for a multitude of them. Currently, our training philosophy is to ignore many of the signs to show what the airplane does. And if I would take the car industry as an example, this would be akin to having a simulator simulating a perfect car crash, but we prevent the car crash by braking, by teaching them to accelerate and decelerate. And all those tasks are supporting the prevention of an undesired aircraft state. And in the end, hopefully, the need for recovery in the first place. So what are our future needs? First of all, training costs will need to be reduced while we are maintaining quality. The current footprints need to be analyzed for cost effectiveness and also to make sure that they achieve the competencies rather than only be compliance based. But a lower cost basis might mean that the perfect tool is beyond reach, which cannot lead to a training stop. We need to understand that the tools that we have at hand can support part and maybe most of the training. And for other training, you can go to expert organizations like APS or others and make sure that the training gets done, but gets done right. We also need to understand that time away from home or a base reduces operational efficiency, and we need to make sure that other methods of training need to be allowed and credited by regulatory authorities. And we need a blended learning environment that is used, for example, in colleges and universities to incorporate all training objectives and the tools used. The training objective drives the optimization of the devices, and they should be selected by the user, not driven by the regulator. Because in the end, the quality needs to be maintained or improved. Second, the training that we do will need to become learning, because the training as it's currently done does not necessarily lead to learning, but it often only ticks the regulatory boxes. Actual learning, however, is achieved less than we expect, both by the aviators, the instructors right now, and the future generations. And that is sometimes due to incorrect or old-fashioned technology use and the teaching methods. We need to get with the times and look outside how and with what to best teach. So not only will curricula need to change, but also we need to incorporate a swath of blended tools that actively interact with the student and supplement each other to support their learning. And the learning should support competency achievement rather than just sole compliance. Then, training and technology need to work hand in hand, because both in the learning and technology fields, we need to look beyond what is currently done, and especially what is done in aviation only. Any tool on which training leads to a better result and leads to a safer pilot should be considered and should be credited. That means that cross-field technology with possible aviation benefit needs to be assessed. And innovation should lead to better tools, better training, and better outcomes. But technology never should become the driver. The training organization and the training itself should determine the technology used and not the other way around. Because invention of new or better tools does not necessarily lead to better training. We always need to make sure that we evaluate the cost effectiveness, the efficacy of the training tools, because we cannot afford to create a $5,000 solution for a $5 problem. So what is the regulatory activity and intent? Well, the task-to-tool analysis will lead us to opportunities by using other technologies than aerobatic airplanes and full flight simulators only, which can reduce the cost and increase the effectiveness and flexibility of training by having a multitude of tools available specifically identified for the task. So a combination of existing and new devices or tools will reduce the dependency on full flight simulators and improve the end result. With deeper integration of the correct technology and non-full flight simulator devices in training, it should lead to ultimately reach higher competency achievement by the optimization of learning and to identify the correct tool at the right time. And these same tools that are used in the initial training, in the type rating training, can and should be used for the training during the entire career of the pilot, including their recurrent training after they are qualified, which that will reduce the cost of training and encourage organizations to invest in the correct training tools for their specific needs. As I said earlier, I want to identify a little bit more about the FSTD capability signature or FCS. It is a concept that is adaptable to new technologies. We need to understand that training can be parsed into many different ways, and the supporting equipment can be identified as well. The FCS, which was called DNA before, identifies the specific capability in a specific way. For example, whether you need a visual or a motion or sound cues or airplane specific capability. And the FCS concept is adaptable to new technologies like VR, AR, MR, AI, and what have you. And it will lead to an innovation where the actual task to tool identification can lead to new tools. So in conclusion, we need to understand that training will become more local and lower cost tools are needed. We cannot afford to fly to a centralized location to do the training, spend days, maybe even weeks away from home. We need to get creditable, correct tools for the correct training. A new training paradigm, including use of new tools, is also needed to support the competency achievement. And training and technology need to go hand in hand and be task to tool based. In the end, what needs to be achieved can be supported by a specific tool, whatever it looks like. We also need to drive regulators and industry to accept this, because new technology use and other novel ways of training need to be implemented rapidly. Too long we have relied on the old-fashioned way. And as I've said in previous speeches, doing the same thing and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity, and we cannot go on. So don't wait for the perfect tool to start your training if you have tools that support achieving the learning objectives right now. Those tools can vary from books to iPads to VR, MR, whatever. But in the end, the perfect tool is a combination of a syllabus, an instructor, and the appropriate tools. With that, I want to thank you for your attention, and back to you, Randy.
All right, thank you very much for that presentation, Philip. I think that sets us up to answer a good number of questions. I want to invite our listeners that if you have any questions, you have this rare opportunity with somebody that's worked at Boeing, that's worked in simulation, that's worked on several different regulatory groups regarding UPRT. I know there's a couple of subjects I'm going to be asking him about first. So if you have some questions for Captain Adrian, please put them into the chat stream. But before we get to those, Philip, you're in a great position as a CEO of a company that makes training devices and as a pilot that worked at Boeing for 11 years to describe a concept, a term that we know has been mentioned in several of our sessions today, and that's the validated training envelope. Tell us what it is that we're validating and how it is that we go about that validation, please.
Well, thank you for that question and setting me up for failure right from the beginning. So yeah, we talk about the validated training envelope. Actually, the way the training envelope is determined is from the inside out. We start at the OEMs, you start with flight test data. What you have to remember is that that flight test data is not gathered necessarily for the simulated data package only. It is gathered for the airplane certification. So, for example, and this is an example that might be misunderstood. The stall data that you get from the airplane flight testing has nothing to do with the post-stall environment. It has to do with the fact that the OEM is benefiting from the lowest possible stall speed because it improves its performance for the airplane, because everything or a lot of the performance is based on the stall speed. So the flight test pilots during a flight test stall do it completely different than the intent of the operational stall recovery. That's also the reason why the data packages in the beginning, when we started this effort, were so limited, because a roll-off was basically not ever identified as needed. And initially, especially under the FAA, where you did yearly stall training at 10,000 feet, it was basically a vertical maneuver only with a pitch down and nothing else. The validated training envelope that is now in some expanded envelope devices uses some additional data points from that flight test that were previously either not incorporated or were never identified. So this comes back to a question that we might come to later, is the availability of this data in the first place. But the first and the center part of a validated training envelope is the flight test data itself. That comes from the airplane, and that is the way it is. Then after that, you have aerodynamic extrapolation from known models. Computational fluid dynamics play a role. All those kind of things, where we have a very good and very reasonable expectation of how the airplane will behave in that simulation that we're doing. But it's not validated by actual data points from the flight test. Then after that, to make sure that basically the gray holes, the empty parts are filled in, we use extrapolation from models and those kind of things to fill out the rest of the data. But that data is less capable and less deep and less dense than the flight data that we get. So from the inside to the outside, it is airplane, then computational fluid dynamic and aerodynamic models, and then extrapolation from that to the end. And the further you go from the inside, the less likely it is that it is an exact replication of the airplane.
And then at the device level, it needs to be validated or verified by a pilot that has actually been in that regime and knows whether or not the airplane behaves that way, correct?
Yeah, correct. And that was one of, and it still is one of the issues, especially for the stall modeling. When you talk about amplitude and stuff like that, large commercial airplanes stall differently at different altitudes. You have a similar aerodynamic stall in some cases, but in other cases at high altitude, it will be buffeting to such an extent that you don't even reach the point of stall. What we have seen, especially during my time with Boeing, when I worked with international regulators and also validated the simulators, is that even though the stall model might have been incorporated correctly in the device at the manufacturer, whichever manufacturer it was, when it was flown out by the regulator or the expert pilot at the regulator, it was tuned down because, the other simulator next to it was not, didn't do that. So this must be wrong. And quite often we have had simulator to simulator comparison rather than simulator to airplane comparison as it should be. So this is also where we have to be really careful that we do not build our knowledge based on the way the simulator behaves, because in the end, the simulator is a combination of the airplane data, the extrapolated data, and the subjective analysis of somebody that might not have been in a situation that the airplane is being flown at this point in time by you or by the instructor.
Yeah, one of the things that we see is because simulators are so good in the normal envelope where we normally fly them, that people then assume that if they get outside of the normal flight envelope into those regions that, as you say, are extrapolated or worse, that they just assume that that's how the airplane must work. Well, let's go on to a slightly different area. We may come back to data here in a minute, and that is the effects of motion. For those of us that are listening that happen to be Airbus pilots or know others that are, they might be aware that Airbus recommends against the use of motion in teaching upset prevention and recovery training. Well, then in that case, how would that really different from using a fixed base device such as one of that MPS manufactures?
So I want to answer this in two ways. One is from the Airbus perspective, but also maybe from the perception management perspective. I hear it from previous speakers, and I hear it in industry. Non-full flight simulators are considered, and we call them, even in regulation, we call them lower level devices. I think that does not do justice to the current state of the level 6 devices or FTD2 devices like MPS produces. The devices that are the only difference between a full flight simulator level D device and a level 6 device FAA is that there is no motion. They do have the full aerodynamic package. They all have the data from Airbus and or Boeing. They have flight control feedback. They have everything that you want. The only thing is that they don't have motion. Now, motion can lead to what is called an expectation of excellence. Just because it moves, it must be right, and it's not. And that's what our Airbus identifies too. We saw this during low cart and at later stages as well. The problem with simulators and the simulator motion envelope is that they can do initial cueing quite well, but after that they cannot do the continuous motion. And with that, you run the risk of teaching pilots that the initial cueing is right, so everything else must be right. And that could lead to what is called negative transfer of training. Now, this has come up before as well. This is not the same as negative training. Negative transfer of training is where you learn something in a device, whether it's a full flight simulator, a fixed base simulator, or in VR, that when you apply that knowledge or that skill that you have learned in the actual airplane will not lead to the desired result. Where negative training is just that. It is training that is perceived to be or has been negative, leading to an undesired outcome of the training itself. But it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the transfer of learning. So coming back to your question, Airbus has said, as long as there is no 100% correct motion throughout the entire envelope and throughout the entire procedure or maneuver, we recommend to not use motion because there is no benefit of it. And then coming back to your original question, yes, why not do it in a level 6 device or in the future? I've always said, if we can find a golden teaspoon and I can hit you on the head 3 times and you become a safe pilot, that in itself should become a training tool. So we are too technology focused, and we think that because it moves and it's called an FFS level D, that it is the only tool that we need, and it's not.
We have about 7 minutes left, Philip, so that allows me to get into a few stories. You and I met when I was with a simulator engineering and manufacturing firm. They had manufactured the devices for Eclipse Aviation. We had 3 level D devices and a level 6 that just hadn't had legs added yet. And so it was the same in every other regard, which was kind of handy for me because, of course, for the 142 training, they had to use motion, and those 3 devices were busy. But it meant that I had this non-motion device that I was able to use. It was about the same time that APS, this was before I came to join this organization, was going airplanes or simulators, which do we do first? And of course, we've now firmly answered that. But, you talked earlier about components of training. And when we have combined assets, as in that case, I had an L39. So we were getting real motion. We didn't need to simulate the motion. We were getting some of that cueing, and then put somebody in the environment with exactly, the control field that they're going to have. You sort of had the best of both worlds. It was also while I was at Eclipse that and I think most pilots aren't aware of this, there were 2 different flight test programs. There was the flight test program for certification, and then there was the flight test program to gather the data that was required for the simulator model. And so let's talk now about that data that goes into the simulator model and how the limitations on accessing that data, how that flows into the devices that you and others have to make when there's limitations on access to that data.
Yeah, so Randy, that's an excellent question, and thanks for the lead-in. It is something that we're struggling with, and right now that is once again why my subtitle was "Why Wait for Perfect When You Can Use Good Enough." We see that due to the lack of the data from older flight test situations, I think, for example, if you would look for data from a 707 or from an A300, that data would be a lot less rich. And the availability of that data, combined with the effort that is needed at the manufacturer, the OEM of the airplane, to create that expanded data, will lead to significant costs. And you see two things here. First of all, organizations are not able to validate that cost or to justify that cost, or the data just doesn't become available from the OEM. You have alternative solutions. I know David Gingras is on from Burley Applied Research. They do a great job in providing extra information. But in the end, if that data is not available, you're basically stuck with the current regulations because you do not have an upgraded device, and therefore you shouldn't be doing training, or so the regulator says. And that's what I'm preaching against. In the end, any training that we start and do right, we need to start and do right. We cannot wait for the perfect technical solution if it's either physically unachievable because the OEM doesn't provide the data, or it's regulatorily unachievable because there is no expert pilot to support it, or there's no regulator that can do it, or it's cost inhibitive. In the end, that cannot stop the training. We need to make sure that we do the training right. Now, coming back to another thing you said is we need to understand that this is lifelong training. You start as soon as you see the airplane. And every training you do, in LOCART, we had Susan McHaffey that said, isn't all the training we do upset prevention training? And it is. In essence, every time we are in an airplane or we're learning or we're studying, it is prevention training. Now, under EASA regulations, we have added the requirement for on-airplane training to make sure that you deal with the physiological effects, that you deal with the G effects that cannot be identified. And it's actually an entry requirement for going into a type rating. And then during the type rating, the signs, the way the airplane communicates to you is what is important. It's not the technology, it's not anything else, but it is how does the airplane talk to you? And what I said in LOCART, and I still stand by that, I'm hoping that in 5 years, 10 years from now, everybody is talking about why were they so stupid and focusing on recovery, because 100% prevention is what we should be focusing for. But until that time, and that time will not come in, unfortunately, in my lifetime, we need organizations like APS, we need devices like the ones that are currently in the inventory, but also new devices, to do correct training throughout the pilot career.
The way we look at it, Philip, there's nothing the matter with both belts and suspenders when we're talking about the number one cause of fatalities, not the
Absolutely.
second or third. I have to tell you, you're getting plenty of thumbs up from the audience, but unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to tell the folks that are watching that if you want to watch one of the following sessions, we have two left. The last one is going to be a roundup of questions with as many of our presenters as can join us. That all you have to do is go back to the homepage or for the event and refresh, and it should take you to the next event. But I'm afraid that's all that we have time for on this session. I'd like to thank our presenter, Captain Philip Adrian. Thank you so much, Philip. It's always a pleasure working with you.
Thanks so much, Randy. Great job.